Hi, my name is Sam Wong, and I'm here with Fundable Startups to talk to you about how to find and pitch startup investors. If you're a startup founder, you know that investor fundraising is one of the most difficult things to do. But we want to present to you a 5-step methodical process on how to be able to raise funds. We will dive into that first step, the introduce phase, and then the second step, justify. We're going to dig into that deeply in this session to help you understand how to present your fundable company to a startup investor and get traction with them. Then we'll wrap up with a summary and some solutions to describe how to be able to take it to the next step. This session is just a small piece of a much larger library of startup fundability content that we have to help you, startup founders, raise funds for your company. Let's get started. In this topic, we want to get to the reality is of getting the pitch right is actually a lot of work. Sadly, most investor pitches fail. We can see from this example that we found up on Quora where there's a founder who says they spent 10,000 hours trying to work on their startup but just couldn't raise any funds. 10,000 hours is actually 5 years full time. That's an awful lot of time to work on your company and still fail at raising startup funds. That underscores the reality that most investor pitches fail. In order to address this, we have to understand why. You shouldn't just keep trying to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. The reality is there are many threats that can kill your startup fundraising process. One of them is not having a good connection with the investor. You don't have a way to really incentivize them to listen to you. Another is I've seen many founders have the wrong focus where they ignore WIFM, and we'll describe what that really is. I've seen other founders move too fast and make an ask prematurely, and it really turns off investors. We've also seen founders not do a very good job with their story. Their pitch is not clear, concise, catchy, nor comprehensive. There's a lot of missing content in the pitch. Or we have seen founders do a very poor job of demonstrating how they've de-risked their company because you have to tell a story that is compelling. We've also seen founders do a poor job in delivering their pitch, which really sends poor signals to the potential investor. But fundamentally, the most important challenge is the company tends to not be fundable. The company is actually not ready to raise funds, which is one of the things that we emphasize in our startup training. We're going to touch upon a lot of conceptual topics, but the risk here is many founders will think that these high-level sound bites will solve all their problems, and they won't. Okay? We have learned over the years from doing many startup companies that the high-level concepts typically are not enough to help founders succeed. We encourage people to not just be satisfied with what to do, which we will cover here, but to dive into how. For example, what you might try to do is maybe bake a cake. That's usually not enough. As a founder running a startup, you need to be able to know how to bake a cake. And what we try to provide founders is a framework or a recipe and a cake mix, a process with the necessary tools for founders to be able to execute on their goal, building a company and raising funds. Where are we coming from? Well, in relation to our pitch experience, we have worked with a number of startup accelerators, from Berkeley Skydeck to Alchemist Accelerator. We also have built a network of investors. In fact, we have a podcast, if you will, a fireside chat where we introduce investors to founders and we interview investors to help them communicate what it is that they are looking for when they invest in startups. We're also great communicators in that we've written a book on startup execution. Okay? We have built a number of startup training classes, a library of 35 hours and counting of startup training to help you as a founder succeed. And a big part of that in the fundraising process is our full service, done for you pitch development process. Finally, we served often as a pitch judge, whether it be for a number of angel groups and venture firms, as well as a number of pitch events such as Pitchforce. We've recorded a number of these pitch sessions and posted them up on YouTube. You can find more about it if you go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Fundable. fundable startups. Well, what are we trying to do here? I mentioned before I'm with Fundable Startups, and our mantra is 90 days to fundability. We specialize in great startup execution to help you as a founder build a fundable company and fundraise. What is my background? Well, I have done a startup 5 different times. It's very painful. I was a CEO one time, a CTO one time, and a technical VP 3 different times. As I mentioned before, I'm also a CEO coach and an author. I wrote a book here, 21 Secrets of Successful Startups. I serve typically as a fractional CEO, CTO, or CFO. I'm thankful to have gone through 4 different acquisitions of companies I've been at, 3 sell side, 1 buy side, and several others that also got acquired where I was an advisor. We build startup training and coaching when we've gotten hundreds of rave reviews. Our focus in delivering the coaching and the training is on resources and processes and methodologies because we're not fans of random bits of information, hacks, tips, and tricks. So in our training courses, we include a lot of color by numbers tools. We have a number of done-for-you solutions, such as our Venture Validator service, where we do product market fit analysis, help research ideal customers, help you identify product objections, feedback, and pricing. We also do funding strategy as well as pitch decks, as we've already talked about. So let's dive into this next step, which is the investor pitch lifecycle. You need to know the flow of how the dance, if you will, goes with an investor so you can avoid breaking some unwritten rules. First off, I'd like to ask, what is the goal of an investor pitch? And I'll pause for just a moment for you to think about that. Many startup founders will instinctively say, well, that's kind of obvious. It's to get a check. If that's what popped into your mind as the answer to this question, then unfortunately you're wrong. Okay. The right answer is the investor pitch. The goal is to get more time with the investor or to move along to the next step. Well, what is that next step? That's where we want to look into the investor pitch life cycle. This life cycle starts with the introduce phase, where you're going to have a short story, a short pitch to communicate to a potential investor. Hopefully, if you've done a good job there, that creates interest, which allows you to ask for a more detailed pitch. This is where you have a one-on-one conversation, a one-on-one meeting with the investor, and you justify what it is that you're building. All the things that you've claimed in your short pitch, you justify that in a more detailed pitch. If you've done a good job with that, that will lead to strong interest from the investor, and they will invite you to a process called due diligence, where they verify the claims that you've made. If you've done a good job with due diligence, then it leads to hopefully a term sheet where you begin negotiating for a definitive agreement of how much the investor will invest and on what terms. That leads to a signed contract, at which point the investor wires you the money and you are now funded. The goal of the investor pitch is to get to the next step. Unfortunately, what we found is most startup advisors tend to focus their advice just on the pitch deck process, which is where you're going into the detailed pitch. Of course, that's important, but we want to emphasize that every step is key, and there's no one step that should be overemphasized above another. And certainly, do not skip any steps. This session here, even though there's 5 steps overall, this session will focus primarily on the introduce and justify steps due to time limitations. And unfortunately, we can only cover some high-level overview. We have additional information through our training classes, which gets into detail, and we'll refer to that later on in this session. So if you have this 5-stage process, introduce, justify, verify, negotiate, and fund, okay? Introduce is really about how do you initially find the investor, how do you engage that investor? And there's typically 4 different touch points. We have an initial outreach, maybe an elevator pitch, or possibly you may send them an email of your deck, or you might meet the investor at a structured pitch event like a demo day. The justify phase usually is about 2 or more private one-on-one meetings with either an associate or a scout for the investor, or with the key decision makers, the partners themselves. Okay. The verify step is a a series of work where you will have many iterative conversations where the investor is probably going to give you a checklist of things they want to know about your company in a fair amount of detail. You're going to take everything on that checklist, load it into a cloud drive, usually referred to as a data room, and you'll share that with the investor, and you'll go back and forth to explain some of the content that you've shared. If you've done a good job with all of this process up to this time, the investor will probably give you a term sheet, at which point they will negotiate with you several key terms on the definitive investment. And if you sign the contract, then the investor will wire the funds to you. But before you can get into that, let's look at this, the step of introducing yourself to the investor, where you build a relationship with the investor. The unfortunate reality is many investors have to guard their time. Why? Well, it's because they get so many requests that tends to flood their inboxes, or lots of people want something from them, that they can't really address all of the questions or all the requests that come in. There are 4 common ways where the average founder will connect with an investor. They can do it through an initial email or LinkedIn message or whatever type of messaging platform. If you're doing that, the initial connection really tends to not have any slides, okay? And it oftentimes is written only, meaning that there's not an opportunity for you to have an interactive conversation. Whatever message you send, email, LinkedIn messages, whatever it may be, that message has to stand on its own. We generally recommend that these initial outreach emails, these initial outreach messages, that you target the investor spending no more than 30 seconds, half a minute of time for the investor to know what it is that you're doing and make a decision about what they want to do next. These initial emails are usually used when there's just no history, no contact, whatever. You're just doing ice cold outreach. The second common method of reaching out to an investor is what I would call more of an elevator pitch. You typically are not going to have slides, but you will have an opportunity to talk to the investor, because these elevator pitches, by definition, are done in person or live interactively, where you're actually having a conversation. Again, we would recommend that you target the elevator pitch to take no more than 30 seconds of the investor's time to be able to digest and understand. These elevator pitches are typically used when you're in a type of a cold networking event. Maybe you're at a startup event, or maybe you happen to be someplace where investors hang out and you happen to have strike up a conversation with one of them. Okay, you would, in that conversation, you deliver your elevator pitch. The third type of investor outreach method is going to be some type of email send ahead. In some cases, you may choose to just send a pitch deck on to the investor. At that point, you do have slides where you can send, and our encouragement is send a pitch deck that is a simple story. Don't get into all the nitty-gritty, all the gory details, because you don't have an opportunity to go through a talk track. Okay, the story needs to be simple to avoid losing the investor, because statistics show that the average investor spends only 3 to 4 minutes total looking at any pitch deck that you send them. In fact, we ran into an investor the other day who said they only spend 1 minute on average, which is not very long at all. This is why your story needs to be very, very simple. You would typically do an email send ahead of your pitch deck when maybe if you are doing the initial outreach, you might send it ahead in advance. Our general recommendation is wait until you have some type of rapport going, where the relationship has been warmed up a bit, before you send a pitch deck. Okay, but there's lots of different nuances here. But in general, we like to send the pitch deck later, after you've built a rapport with the investor. Finally, the fourth most common method of reaching out to an investor is maybe at a demo day or some type of pitch event. That's where you do have an opportunity typically to share slides, and you want to have an engaging story, a hero's journey of sorts. You are delivering it live, so you do have an opportunity to have an interactive conversation, or at least have a verbal talk track that you can share as you're going through the slides. You will have typically anywhere from 4 to 5 minutes, because you're delivering at a structured event. Okay. If you remember back to the threats this previous slide, the threats that can kill your pitch. We're going to dive into several of them now. The first one is no connection. Okay, what does that really mean? Oftentimes when you're reaching out to a very busy investor, you have to ask, why should they talk to you? They're busy. Okay, they get tons of people reaching out to them every single day. Well, to rise above that, it's important that you connect with their interests. When you reach out with the initial outreach, build a connection by starting a conversation. Do this before you make an ask. We see lots of founders immediately dive into making some type of ask, and we believe that is suboptimal and it rarely works. Let me take a moment to talk about warm introductions. There's a line of thought that says warm introductions are the only way that you should ever reach out to an investor. And I understand the logic behind that, but even if you have a warm introduction, that's still just an indirect connection. You may have a third party brokering an introduction, but you still have to build your own direct relationship with the investor. That's why when you look at the 4 types of typical connections, even if you have a warm introduction, you're probably going to do one of these 4, okay? At least one of the first 3, okay? The warm intro only increases the starting temperature, if you will. You're still going to have to do some type of initial email or initial elevator pitch if you're live in person, or the email send ahead, okay? The next thing that we see founders doing in terms of making mistakes is they tend to have the wrong focus. This is tough to say, but I see lots of founders taking a very much of a parasitical view of the reaching out to investor. They come into the investor saying, "Gimme, gimme, gimme." Okay, that's the wrong focus, and it's a really big turnoff. Okay, we encourage founders to focus on WIFM, and if you're familiar with WIFM, it's an acronym for "What's in it for me." If you've got a little bit of marketing background, hopefully you've heard some messaging in the marketing space or goals in the marketing space is designing your ask or your interaction around the benefits to the investor. Okay, and let's talk about some examples here. Instead of saying we have a great product that we're doing, it would be more helpful to say you can be confident because we have great product traction. Instead of saying we have a great product, you now talk about what the investor cares about, their confidence, their concerns and skepticism, whatever it may be. Instead of saying our startup has great potential, you can focus it more on the investor by saying you can get in on the ground floor of a high potential company. And instead of saying, hey, I want you to review our pitch deck, keep in mind maybe some type of thought process around, we're not going to waste your time because we have de-risked the company, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever your message is to that particular investor, focus on how your conversation with them will give them something that they want or they need. Let WIFM guide your ask. We've also seen several founders move way too fast. Okay, we encourage people to think, is your ask reasonable? And I get inquiries like this all the time. This is an example of emails and messages that we get on LinkedIn all the time. The requester comes in and says, "Hello, Mike, I see you're an active investor in IT security. We'd love to tell you about our startup. We're building a patent-pending product to address some problem, which is a huge market. We've got great traction, have a pathway to becoming the next startup unicorn. I've attached your pitch deck and executive summary. Let us know if you're interested in investing. We'd love to have you as part of our investment team. Regards, founder." Well, what's wrong with this request? I'll give you a moment to think about that and noodle on it. What we see here is many times founders are unreasonable in their connection requests, in their emails, their messages. Basically, this message is saying fairly quickly, the founder saying, "Mr. Investor or Ms. Investor, give me some of your time." And then, bold enough to say, "Let us know if you're interested in investing." That's the founder basically saying, "Give me some of your money." Okay. If you look back at the 5 steps in the investor pitch lifecycle, the founder who sends that type of message is basically leaping from step 1 to step 5. They're going from introduce to funding, and they're skipping steps 2, 3, and 4. That's really inefficient and off-putting, honestly. It's almost as if you're telling your investor, or you're trying to get a date and you're saying, here's my Tinder profile. Will you marry me? It just doesn't make sense. Nobody does that in the dating world, but founders do this all the time in the investor outreach space. We also see founders doing a very poor job with their delivery. Your delivery sends signals. If you put people to sleep, chances are the investor will start to conclude you're not a very good salesperson, and their confidence in your ability to not just recruit investors, but their confidence in your ability to recruit customers goes down. It shrinks. They see, okay, even if the company has some potential, if you do a poor job with delivering your pitch, or even worse, the way you deliver it, it just feels kind of sleazy. And sadly, I do get a number of founders who kind of leave me feeling like a little slimed after I talk to them. If you leave that impression, you're probably not going to get very far with that investor. The next step in the Startup Investor Pitch Lifecycle is justify. And this is where you need to show how the typical threats to a startup have been mitigated. Okay, this is the second step, and this is where you would talk about it more in a private meeting. Maybe you have 30 to 60 minutes of the investor's time. Okay. And if you are lucky enough to get to that stage, you should focus on telling a great story about how you have de-risked your startup. So, great story. What is that all about? Well, okay, your investor pitch needs to be clear, concise, comprehensive, catchy, and compelling. This is important because one of the most neglected problems with the typical startup pitch is people don't realize they are not clear. If you can't simply and easily explain what you do, then it doesn't matter what the total addressable market, your traction, your go-to-market, or how much revenue you have. Those are going to shrink into their importance because the investor just doesn't understand. And you may think this is a small deal. When we do pitch decks, we find that probably 60% of our time is spent fixing problems with clarity and with being too verbose. Remember, the average investor only spends 3 to 4 minutes looking at a deck. They're not going to spend tons of time reading 200 words on a slide. That's not going to happen. It is probably the most difficult thing to do to get those 150 or 200 words down to 30 words or 25 words on a single slide. That's a very difficult exercise, and it takes lots of what we consider an expert witness skill set to be able to do that effectively. There's also a challenge where we've seen a number of founders try to be abuse the need to be comprehensive. You certainly don't want to leave off any key concepts that you need to communicate in the pitch, but we've seen founders tend to over-rotate and just pack the pitch with way too much stuff, and they abuse the need to be able to be comprehensive. Then we tend to see founders completely ignore the need to be catchy, or somehow to be able to be compelling, to be captivating, I should say. Most founders don't even consider this. They just think that if I just dump a bunch of content up on a bunch of slides, that you're going to get the investor's attention. Remember that the investor sees potentially dozens of pitch decks every single day. You have to find a way to catch their attention, to captivate them. Okay. And finally, we see the challenge of being compelling as the most important part of your investor pitch, but oftentimes the weakest part. All right. The first 4 elements here, clear, concise, comprehensive, and catchy, that's about how you tell your story. The last component, being compelling, that's where you help the investor to see you have de-risked the company, and the investor has a decent chance of making money should they write you a check. What we find is that many investors get confusing and uninspired pitches. I've seen it over and over again on the times that I've been asked to invest or the times I've served as a pitch judge. Oftentimes, the pitch is just unclear and not differentiated. It's very uninspiring. You, as a founder, need to tell a story that captivates, validates, and motivates. It captivates the investors so that they remember you. And we've got some tips in our storytelling class on how to be able to do that. The validation is really about how you've de-risked things that will threaten that your startup or potentially have it flounder. Okay, and when you've done a good job with captivating and validating, that effectively motivates the investor to take action and take a follow-on dedicated meeting or potentially even go into due diligence. We've also seen founders not do a good job with de-risking their startup. Investors face many, many threats to their investment. They could lose everything. And we understand that founders go through the same journey, but your challenge is you already believe in what you're doing. The investors are coming in cold and they are skeptical because they don't know anything about your startup, and they haven't seen enough to see that you potentially have something of high potential. You have to be able to communicate how you've mitigated those risks. And that's why we have another class in our training on startup pitch deck slides and the importance of de-risking. Don't just put the slides together. The slides have a purpose. That purpose is to de-risk the threats to the company. And instead of just looking at a pitch deck template, which we'll cover in a moment, what I encourage people to do is think of the key sections. Basically, up-level yourself. The key sections of an investor pitch deck are these. Number one, opportunity. This is where you explain the problem and the solution that you found, your unique insight into solving a real-world painful problem. Secondly is the market section. That's where you help the investor to see there's huge potential solving the problem that your company is addressing. Thirdly, and probably the most important and the largest section of a typical investor pitch deck, is the execution section. And that's where you're going to show how you've de-risked the half dozen, 2 dozen, whatever the number of threats that typically challenge a startup's success. And the number and types of risk will really vary based on the type of startup that you are building. So in this execution section, you want to show how you've done a great job with building a company that's on track to win. The fourth section is numbers, financials, basically, where you want to show a plausible financial path or a plausible numerical path to getting traction, raising funds, and from raising those funds, hitting certain investor outcomes, important investor outcomes. The last section is a little bit of a catch-all, and I call it the uniqueness section, where you have to really focus on custom tailoring your story because every startup is different. You can't just do the exact same thing because in some cases you might need to emphasize certain things more than others. And we'll get into that in a little bit more in a moment. So now that we understand these 5 typical sections of an investor pitch, let's talk about the slides. The first slide in the opportunity section is going to be your title slide. Pretty simple, straightforward. The second slide is going to be typically some type of situation, context, or a short elevator pitch. And this slide is optional depending on the type of startup that you're doing. For many startups, we do see that this slide is used because in many cases, the founder needs to communicate to the investor what's important in the current context of the business problem. The next slide is going to be the more of the mid-level view of the high-level problem, where that's captured in the elevator pitch. This is where you're going to get more specific with 3, maybe 4 specific challenges that your solution addresses. So slide 2 is the context. It sets the stage. Slide 3 gets into more granular detail about some of the problems. And slide 4 talks about how your solution addresses the problems that you just highlighted in slide 3. Then that leads us to the market section. Since you've already been talking about the solution in slide 4, we find it's a good, easy segue to talk about the business model or how much you're going to charge for solving that solution. Once you've determined and communicated your pricing, that allows you to calculate and present the market sizing and market opportunity. Many people refer to this as a TAM, SAM, SOM slide. Okay. So the right way to do this is to take the pricing, to calculate your TAM, take your pricing, and if you charge $10 a month, and if you look at the entire world, there might be 1 billion customers who could use your product. Let's say you're Netflix. There could be 1 billion customers with fast enough internet service and the technology platform necessary that they can stream the movies or the content that you create. Well, then you take the monthly recurring fee, $10 times the 1 billion customers, that's $10 billion, and that's your total addressable market. If you sold your product to every possible customer, what would the market size be? That is the right way to do it, to present your market opportunity from the bottoms up. Do not do what many founders do, find an analyst that says, by 2027, I estimate that it's going to be a $100 billion market, and then the founder says, oh, if we can only capture 1% of the market, then we'll be this big. That's a top-down approach, and that approach does not work. As an investor, I always throw that out of my mind if a founder tells me this is how they calculated the TAM using a top-down method. When you've communicated the market opportunity, that's a great time to be able to talk about other companies that are in the same space, the competition. And then you can talk about how you're attacking this market, specifically with your go-to-market approach. How are you going to go from where you're at today to acquiring X many customers tomorrow? Once you've described your go-to-market plan, it would be helpful to describe the traction that you've received so far. And there's lots of different forms of traction, from customer traction, employee traction, investor traction, product traction, lots of different ways to be able to communicate that. And this is why you need to be able to customize your messaging based on the type of company you've built and where you're at. If you're an early stage company, well, actually, early or late stage, one of the most important things that every investor looks for is the strength of your team. In your team slide, you should show how the core leaders on the team are the right people to do the job that they've been asked to do. That's the purpose of the team slide. Then you'll get into financials, where you might have some type of bottoms-up analysis on what it will take to execute on your go-to-market, which would result in a certain ask. If the bottoms-up financial says you're going to need $500,000 to hit these, to execute on your go-to-market and these initiatives, then that justifies your ask of maybe $700,000 or whatever the dollar amount may be. In some cases, you can also talk about exit because, again, if you remember the principle of WIFM, what's in it for me, it's useful for the investors to have an idea of how they can potentially make money. And most investors don't really make any money on their investment until the company has an exit, meaning they're acquired or they IPO. The last section, the uniqueness, the customized, custom-tailored section, is made up of a number of slides that you can pull into your deck based on the story that you're trying to tell. You might have a timeline slide, or an underlying magic, or a why now slide. And of course, you'll probably have a closing slide. In most cases, the first 3 to 4 slides typically don't change their sequencing or their order, or the last slide, the closing slide, of course. But the slides in the middle, you can change the order or flow, or even the choice of the slides that you use, okay? So this is where it's important to customize the deck to be able to tell a story that fits with you. Well, that looks like a general pitch deck template, but you may hear and understand and get from me that I'm not a big fan of templates, and I'll explain why in a moment. Most startup founders use a blank pitch deck template where there's dozens of websites that provide some type of downloadable, PowerPoint template or Google Slide template, etc. Well, that's fine, But if you download one or more of those pitch deck templates, what you'll probably see is that most of the focus is on the visual aspects or the formatting of the deck. Okay. If you open up that template, some of them might have a small tip or a suggestion on some of the specific slides, but for the most part, it's just visual with a secondary implied focus on the story flow based on the order of the slides in the deck. But you should remember the goal. It's storytelling. If the goal is storytelling, I have to ask, how many great stories are written using a template? If your goal is to be on the New York Times bestseller list, how often does that happen using a template? If you're like me and you remember playing with these kids' books, Mad Libs. Mad Libs was a rather entertaining book of little short stories. And if you open up the page, they would give you a story of whatever. In this case, an example might be Star Wars. And it would have the narrative mostly filled out, mostly structured for you, and you would just fill in the blanks with other words. Okay. Well, what does that usually create? In this situation, Mad Libs was a little bit of a fun thing for kids because it usually created a crazy story. Unfortunately, that might be a fun thing to do, and it might make it an easy way to get a story put together. But if you're trying to build a bestseller, that's usually not how people do it. You're going to have to do the hard work of writing out your story and reflecting that in the slides. We discourage people from mindlessly filling in blanks in a template. Why? Well, if you look at a template, if you download it, and here's an example of a template, most founders use a template, but the reality is even when they use it, they still tend to fail to raise funds. Okay? Well, maybe you're focused on not just using a template, but you're saying, I'm going to use a template that was successful at raising funds. I'm going to copy someone else's successful deck. And two companies that are oftentimes used as models are Airbnb and Uber. So you can often, if you do a Google search, you can often find a website where they'll give you a version of Airbnb or Uber's pitch deck as a great example, and you should copy it. And they may even claim this version of the Uber pitch deck was used to raise $37 million in their Series B fundraising. Well, we find that that's problematic because very few startups are similar enough to just copy what they're doing. Getting Uber's Series B pitch deck to raise $37 million is probably not going to be that helpful for you because unless you're Lyft at the exact same point in time with the exact same momentum, you're probably not going to get much from copying what Uber says because the evolutionary process, the maturity of you building your startup is different. What might be a good deck for the company at the far right, a mature human, if you will, may not be a good deck. In fact, it may be a terrible deck for the company that's the second one down the line, because that second company is just a young chimpanzee. It hasn't evolved yet to the human state at the far right. We don't like mindlessly cloning another startup's deck and just putting in your numbers or whatever, because your startup is different, and mindlessly cloning something does not allow you to tell your unique story. Every startup is different. Does that mean we're against templates? No, not at all. In fact, we offer a template up on our website, fundablestartups.com, okay, and in our training. But what we encourage people to do is to understand the purpose of the template. You can start baking a cake with a cake mix, but to make it really special and to stand out, you should custom tailor the template to your specific taste and what it is that your startup has done. Okay, that leads us to the next topic of fundability. We encourage people that fundraising is not about the slides in your pitch deck. But sadly, just about everybody out there focuses on the pitch deck. You just do a Google search on startup pitch deck and you're going to get hundreds of thousands of search results. I've just copied a couple of them here. And most of these search results talk about slides of your pitch deck. In fact, some of these results even make a bold claim to say the 10 best pitch deck templates to get your startup funded. How to build an investor pitch deck that gets your startup funded. That implies the deck gets you funded? That's not true at all. A great business gets you funded. Having a deck is just about telling a story of how you've built a great business. Do not just blindly assume that the pitch deck itself, if you fill in a template, that it's going to get you funded. It's crucially important before you fundraise to make sure you are fundable. It's been said before that finding an investor is like dating. Okay. Well, if you're trying to find a date, so to speak, who is the preferable date? The person on the left or the person on the right? The person on the left looks like they have their life together. The person on the right, horror movie. Okay. We encourage people to focus on fundability. The person on the left here builds a fundable company. And if you've built a fundable company, then when you do go out to fundraise, it will go faster, easier. You'll come at higher valuation and with better terms. If you try to raise funds before you're fundable, or maybe if you're marginally fundable, then the fundraise process is going to go slower. It's going to take a lot longer. You're going to find that it's a lot harder to execute on. And even if you're able to raise funds, it'll probably come at a lower valuation with really bad investor-friendly terms, which is a big problem. I've got other training content that talks about examples of how bad terms have resulted in founders really potentially losing control of their company or getting peanuts for their company when it does exit. Raising funds is really not about perfecting the pitch alone. Okay? It's really important to go through the process. There is a process for raising pre-seed and seed and Series A funds. In our How to Raise Pre-Seed and Seed Startup Funds, we present that process. It's 5 steps. Prepare, plan, execute, sell, and close. Okay? Notice that it's not until the 4th step that you start to pitch investors. Before you do step 4, you need to get steps 1, 2, and 3 done, which is where you build fundability for your company. So what are we doing? Let's kind of summarize. I've talked about a lot of things, okay? And I do encourage people to stay to the end because there's a few other recommendations and insights about how to learn and how to be able to deliver, okay? The reality is there are startups everywhere. You will need to stand out in order to get noticed. If you look at a graph here of the number of pitches an investor finds and the quality of those pitches, it looks something like this, where on the far left, the number of pitches that are captivating, validating, and motivating, the number of pitches on the far left, they tend to need a lot of work. Most pitches need a lot of work. There are, in some cases, a number of pitches that just need some refinement, some polishing. They're well on their way, but they're not quite there yet. It's a very small number of pitches that really stand out. And in such a large, crowded space where there's lots of very marginal startups, you have to be excellent. You have to strive to pitch like a virtuoso. Anybody who is a serious musician knows that the fine details matter. That's what differentiates an average run-of-the-mill pitch from a truly outstanding pitch, or an average run-of-the-mill musician from a truly outstanding concert musician. The fine details matter. So how do you acquire some skills here? Typically, the vast majority of founders have never been pitch experts. Okay, so I have here an article from Harvard Business Review on how to master a new skill. It's a great article written by Amy Gallo. If you dig into this particular article, then the author says it's important to get the right help and to go with the best teacher. These are some very practical tips on just building skills, because there's really multiple ways to be able to do this. And if you take a step back on how people learn, there is an academic approach, which is very much a classroom-centric pedagogical approach. You learn from a book, you learn from a whiteboard or whatever else, and that's certainly one way to be able to learn. But there is another approach, and that's typically done more in the athletic environment where it's heavy on coaching. Okay, we believe that it's important. Both of these are important. Just like if you are learning how to drive, if you have a kid who's learning how to drive, they should learn the rules of the road in a classroom setting. But before they get their license, they sit with a professional trainer, a driver's training instructor behind the wheel to apply what they learned in the classroom with real world experience. It's that coaching which is very, very key. And I have a quote here from Vince Lombardi, the former head coach of back in the 1960s, the multiple champion Green Bay Packers. His quote was, "Practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect." If you think about this, how much practice is required to perfect your pitch and your pitch delivery? It's a lot. It's non-trivial. And sadly, I don't see nearly enough founders putting in the time, energy, and effort to learn the process in the classroom, to get good coaching, and to practice. You should ask, how good is your pitch really? And when you practice your pitch, don't just rely on your friends or your mom to say, "Yay, good job," okay? You typically won't get very good, honest feedback. You should focus on getting help from true pitch experts. And living here in the Silicon Valley, what we've also found is that anybody can give pitch feedback, but not all pitch feedback is the most useful. We found just night and day difference in working with true knowledgeable experts. And a knowledgeable expert has a process for how they give you feedback. We have built a pitch deck scorecard. We have it on our blog on our fundablestartups.com website. This scorecard is different and unique because it takes into account the two different stages, early stages of raising funds, from pre-seed seed to Series A. And the reason it takes that into account is depending on where you're at in your company, a Series A company is actually expected to be farther along. So the investor will have different criteria on what you've accomplished to assess whether they want to invest. For example, they might actually expect that you have booked revenue. If you're a Series pre-seed or seed company, you may not have any revenue yet, but it's still very possible to raise funds. Of course, if you have revenue, that certainly doesn't hurt. But it's our pitch deck scorecard has a switch to be able to determine whether you're raising Series A and Series Seed, and that switch changes the weighting, which is that center column right there in the middle of the scorecard. That weighting changes the calculation of the final score. Our scorecard also takes into consideration a recommended time budget on a per topic basis. Sometimes you'll have 1 minute to deliver a pitch, sometimes you'll have 5, sometimes you'll have 20 minutes to deliver a pitch. And the amount of time that you spend and potentially the topics that you cover will differ based on that time budget. So our pitch scorecard also has recommendations to take that into account. You can download the pitch scorecard at our website. We will put the shortened link up on our description for this YouTube video, so you can refer to this scorecard separately. We, with all the processes, all the pitch decks that we've judged, we use this scorecard ourselves to evaluate a pitch on up to as many as 16 different categories. We provide a summary score, an adjusted weighting with actual notes. And oftentimes when we're hired to help a startup founder with their pitch, we take a lot of detailed notes. In this particular example, 783 words worth of content to give specific feedback on what the founder needs to change to be able to improve their final score so that they can move their pitch effectiveness more towards the top and be more effective. Most founders need help. We understand that the pitch fundraising process is complex and it is hard work. If you need help, we at Fundable Startups have lots of ways to be able to offer the help. We have self-paced training, we have a live training academy, we do coaching, and we do customized projects. In the spectrum, on the left, we have do it yourself, where you take our training and you apply it yourself. In the middle, it's done with you. And then on the far right, it's done for you. Specifically, self-paced training in the context of fundraising, we have 4 fundraising classes. The Live Academy is a 6-week fundraising academy that covers some of the topics in the 4 fundraising classes and more content, and we deliver that live for people who prefer that type of learning. We also can do coaching, where we have 2 different offers where we will selectively and iteratively refine your pitch, and we have fundraising projects where we'll actually build the deck for you in a full service environment. If you're interested in any of this, you can scan this QR code, pause the video, scan the QR code, or just check the video description, and there's a shortened link where you can book a 20-minute consultation to talk to us about any of these offers and help put together a plan about how to get from where you're at to being confident with your fundraising process. The self-paced training consists of 4 classes: how to sell and fundraise effectively, pitch deck storytelling, pitch deck slides, that's the template, and de-risking, and then finding and closing investors. You can learn more about these offers on our fundraising page. We have a 100% money-back guarantee for 30 days. Our second offer is a fundraising academy, where we take our pre-built content, expand on it for the academy because we want to teach more. We have a go-to-market and marketing class, and that's pretty important because we see one of the biggest challenges with the typical startup is with their success in go-to-market. We have an investor mindset class. We have a pitch storytelling class. This is a 6-week process. Week 3 is pitch deck storytelling, where we get into details of how to tell a very captivating, validating, and motivating pitch. Week 4 is pitch deck slides and how to demonstrate visually that you've de-risked the slides and how to be able to communicate and capture specific content on a slide-by-slide basis. Week 5 is finding and closing investors, where we teach people how to target, how to reach out, specific tactics on how to be able to connect with investors, to be able to get a term sheet. And then we also talk about the fundraise process with the typical fundraising Series Seed documents as a baseline. Then the last week is about scripting and practicing your pitch. You'll be delivering it live to get feedback. And then if you join the academy, there's also a live investor pitch opportunity where you'll pitch typically about 5 or 6 investors after you've gone through the class. The third offer is really a fundraising pitch deck coaching, where you may submit a pitch to us. We'll give you written feedback, and then we'll repeat that process with a live, after repeating that process one time, we end with a live coaching session. We also have a more detailed or more involved process where we teach in our classes. We encourage you we give you access to the 4 classes mentioned: the sales skills, storytelling, de-risking, and the Finding Investors class. And then once you've taken that and incorporated some of that on your own, you can submit your pitch deck, a recording of you pitching it, and then we will provide a written scorecard, and we'll have 4 separate sessions where we'll go back and forth to help you iteratively refine the process. Okay. So we also have a full service pitch deck offer where we have a bronze, silver, and gold. The bronze is really about rebuilding an existing pitch. The silver is building a new pitch from your existing story, and the gold is a new pitch with a new story. That provides a increasing number of slides. And we also focus in these full service offers on really helping you document and capture a clear and concise value proposition with all of your messaging. This may seem like a trivial thing, but this is actually the most difficult part. Probably about 2/3 of our time on all of our full service pitch decks is spent on this itself, because typically the average founder does not know how to optimize their messaging for the investor pitch. Doing this we've often even had some founders tell us, by cleaning up and polishing and revising, rebuilding the value proposition, oftentimes founders have stated this actually helps them with their product management, and then it changes completely their product marketing approach. We do the pitch topics in the scorecard. We help you build a story that in a flow that makes sense logically. If you work with us on our full service pitch deck offers, we will give you access to all of our fundability training because we want you to build a fundable startup before you try to raise. We'll even give you some diagnostics on our professional opinion on how fundable we think you are in some areas where you might need to focus some time and attention. We can also provide some referrals, but we limit that typically to the most qualified and fundable companies. There's multiple revisions and coaching sessions available. Typically, companies will use bronze to build a pitch deck for pre-seed stage, silver for seed stage fundraising, and gold for Series A, B, or C fundraising with the prices down at the bottom. We are confident that we can help deliver better pitches. Fundable startups oftentimes will be compared with other advisors or maybe some pitch deck experts. Our focus in building pitches is fundability. It's not slides. We, of course, produce slides as the deliverable, but it's important to know that with that fundability focus, that it's really about helping you get in better shape, so to speak, rather than just if reaching out to an investor was like dating, the pitch is more similar to a pickup line than it is about your dateability. Fundability is about your dateability. If you want a quality date or life partner, focus on doing the things that make you dateable. Be kind, compassionate, be selfless, apologize when you're wrong, and just do these things, and you'll probably get a better date than, hey baby, what's your sign? Let me perfect my pickup line type of thing. Many other advisors, we don't know what their focus is. Most deck experts focus on generating very beautiful slides. We ourselves have hands-on startup experience, remember, with 5 different startups. Most advisors, they might have experience with 1 or 2 startups, and most deck experts have never worked at a startup. We've, in addition to having the hands-on startup experience, we've been through 5 exits and 6 companies sold and 1 bought. Okay, so 6 different exits. Most other advisors, hit or miss whether they've gone through an exit. Most deck experts, since they haven't worked at a startup, probably haven't been through a startup exit. We do focus heavily on writing and communication skills as a published author. That may or may not be the case with most other advisors, but I will say most deck experts do a very good job creating very pretty slides, great visuals. We have both business and technical skills on our team. Advisors typically have one but not both, and deck experts, they're just about graphics. We serve as a pitch judge very often with various pitch competitions and accelerators. That may or may not happen with other deck experts. We include, as I mentioned, 35 hours of our premium training to help you build fundability. That's typically not the case with with other advisors or deck experts. Our goal is to provide a proactive, guided journey to help you predictably and repeatably create some results. Most other advisors have a reactive process where you show them something and they'll comment on it rather than giving you a process for you to follow, a repeatable process to follow. Deck experts, graphic design specialists, they may give you very beautiful slides, but is it really fundable? So what we would do here is, in closing, if you're interested and would like to have a consultation, just scan the QR code or, again, refer to the YouTube video description where you can get that shortened link and you can book some time on our calendar. This has been a long conversation. Thank you for sticking in there with us. We hope this has been valuable for you, and we hope to be able to help you build your own fundable company and raise startup funds successfully. Thank you much. Good luck.